Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Today we have a great conference in store for you all. Before we actually start and our Vice President opens the conference, could I kindly remind you just to look at your mobiles and switch them off or put them in silence, just in case? Okay, and without further ado, let me invite Carl Crane, Vice President and Managing Director of EU Business School, to the stand. Thank you, Carl.
We are here today in the foundation of Miro, and also one of the chapters of Learning from Leaders. Today, I have the honor and privilege to introduce two pioneers, Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, and Andrew Winston, globally recognized leader and best-selling author on megatrends and sustainability. Two professionals who argue that companies can, first of all, make a profit by giving more than what they take, and help fixing the world problems instead of creating them. Their approach to business, net positive, is making the corporate world set up. In a deep dive interview today with Peter Van Ham, author of Before I Was CEO, they will explain how companies can serve its stakeholders and at the same time tackle world challenges such as climate change, inequality, and poverty, and still be healthy, growing businesses. As a business leader of the future, you students, will you be positive, have a positive impact on the society? If yes, this is the opportunity to learn today and be net positive. So let me introduce you to Paul and Andrew, and I welcome them on stage. Have a good conference. Thank you.
You go ahead. So I'll start right away. Let me just put this down. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. That sounds a little better. How are you doing? Who is from Spain? Raise your hands. Okay.
Wow.
Who's from the rest of the world? Man, you guys made a good choice to be in Barcelona. I wish I would have done that. Listen, let me first thank obviously Carl here and Claire that are here, Peter that will be coming in, and then your dean, Isabel, who is not with us. But I was just looking a little bit more in detail.
I didn't realize I was on. I'm on, apparently.
Okay, Andrew is on. So you could see, by the way, on the titles here, Andrew is twice a leader. I'm just a CEO. Sorry about that. You have to listen to me first. Anyway, the EU Business School, I just wanted to tell you, I just was reading a little bit about it, but it's pretty impressive. You know, you nearly have 30,000 alumni as a force for change. Here in Barcelona, you have about 1,400 students that will be added to this alumni. Your rankings are enormous. You're coming from all countries of the world, over 100 of them. I mean, that's just a privileged position. And then your mission to be able to create the leaders to be ready for tomorrow's world, which already is here today, if you want to, and drive the changes that are needed, and sticking to your values of what you stand for. These are probably the most important things you can do. This world, as we will talk about, is short of leaders in anything. Most of these issues that we will be talking about boils down to leadership. Yes, it's always nice to have a little bit more technology and to have a little bit more funds to our availability to throw money at it. But at the end of the day, it is how we individually and collectively behave. Humanity wouldn't function if we don't fight for some of the basic values. We're reminded of that again today, yesterday, the day before. It's the tragedies that are happening all across in the world. Basic values like dignity and respect. Basic values like equity. Basic values like humanity. Climate change doesn't have any boundaries. It doesn't have any borders. COVID doesn't have any borders either. Nor does poverty anymore. If we live in a world still where too many people feel that they're not participating, or where people feel that they're excluded from any economic process, then automatically these people will rebel. Especially now with the possibilities of social media and other channels of communication to see what others are able to get in this world. Exclusion doesn't work anymore. It goes to the heart of human development. You're being tested right now. You're being tested because you're over 100 countries. And some of your countries are dealing with challenges that are not the challenges that we wish to put upon anybody. Be it regional conflicts, be it challenges of poverty, be it wars, be it exclusion. This is your test to show if you are the real leaders to help in society as we move forward. This is the test to show if the reasons why you went to wonderful institutions like this is to truly be able to operate like global citizens, is to truly be able to respect and provide dignity to all of you, starting between yourselves and then the broader societies that you're going to serve. If you guys cannot figure it out between yourselves, I would be very pessimistic for the future. If you can come out stronger and help address these challenges that are now so prevalent in many parts of the world, then I have hope. Hope for my children, hope for my 6 grandchildren, and hopefully for many more generations to come. Does that make sense? Yeah. Who is committed to work with each other, try to understand and protect these basic human rights, have the respectful differences of discussions, but at the end of the day, collectively try to find solutions? Raise your hands if you're committed. That's what we need right now. There's no question about it. You know, we've been incredibly successful over the last few decades in lifting enormous amounts of people out of poverty. Over the last 7 decades since World War II, our production has gone up 12 times, whilst our population only has gone up 3 times. So that means we've actually created 4 times more wealth than we had before. The United Nations started in the year 2000, the Millennial Development Goals, which had a simple objective to halve the number of people living in poverty. At that time, in the year 2000, it was defined as $1.25 a day. It wasn't very much. I wouldn't be able to live off it. But we succeeded in halving the number of people in poverty. Not in the 15 years that we gave, we actually did it in 13 years. And sure, China and the enormous development that we saw in that part of the world was a big part of it, but also in many other countries. And then we said, if we go halfway and halve the number of people in poverty, and if we can do that collectively in 15 years, why not finish the job? Why not finish the job and irreversibly eradicate poverty? And do that in a more sustainable and equitable way in the 15 years from 2015 to 2030. You don't stop halfway. Eugene Bolt didn't stop halfway when he ran 50 meters and say, I'll do the other 50 meters tomorrow. The astronauts of Apollo didn't go to the moon halfway and said, well, the food isn't very good, I go home and have some meal and I'll finish the other half the next time. We finished the job. And this is probably the biggest opportunity that we now have. Mankind is at stake. Although we've lifted so many people out of poverty, I think we've increasingly started to realize, as population grew, as wealth grew, that the way we were doing it has become increasingly unsustainable. This linear, extractive way of producing. Of all the things that we produce in the world, only 8% gets reused. The rest ends up in landfills and incineration, or yes, increasingly in the oceans. How old is this world? Does anybody know? This wonderful planet Earth. Make a guess. Yeah, you're close, 3 billion, but more. Billions are not that much anymore these days. There are many billionaires, so go a little higher. 3 billion, what do you think? 7.7 billion. Man, we were here a long time ago. It's actually 4.6 billion years old. The 4.6 billion years, let's call it 46 years for this discussion to make it simple. In those 46 years, the 4.6 billion years, in these 46 years that the planet Earth has been here, human beings have only been here 4 hours. The Industrial Revolution only started 1 minute ago. And yes, we have succeeded in cutting down half the world's forests. And yes, in the last 5 decades, we have succeeded to eliminate about 70% of the species, animals, birds, vertebrates. When is it our turn? Our model of production, of extraction, of using resources that are, frankly, are finite, is irresponsible. Of course we didn't have the problem when population wasn't so big. Of course we didn't have the problem when consumption patterns weren't so high. But now we sure do. We need to fix that. You can't have, on a finite planet, infinite growth. And anything you can't do forever is by definition unsustainable. So the same thing for, so this is the symptoms that we see that we need to attack on this. The most burning symptoms are probably climate change and inequality. Has anybody here heard about climate change? Inequality? They're actually the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. When COVID came, was a small reminder. COVID is what some people call a zoonotic disease. It is a direct result of the destruction of biodiversity. SARS, Zika, Ebola, Asian flu. You've heard of all of them. Zoonotic diseases. The surprise shouldn't have been COVID. We knew it was coming. In fact, we have these diseases every 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And you'll get many more as we move forward, as we keep destroying the natural resources or the biodiversity of planet Earth. The surprise of COVID was probably how unsolidary the world was in dealing with it. The few developed countries pumping them full with vaccines, having a stock of 4 to 5 times what they needed, and refusing to give the vaccines to the developing market. That was probably the surprise. Or the inability of countries to work together to make this PPE material and other things to help people available. That was the surprise. It showed a lack of global solidarity, but we shouldn't be surprised of COVID as we continue to destroy planet Earth. Hubert Reeves, who is a philosopher in Canada, said it very well. When Hubert said, man is the most amazing species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And this is exactly what we are doing. And COVID has shown that it is the poor, the ones that are marginalized, the disadvantaged, the minorities, that pay a disproportionate price. Blacks in America were dying 2.5 to 3 times more than whites. The poorer countries didn't have access to the vaccines. The people that were already in vulnerable jobs were even more exposed. 150 million people pushed back into poverty, absolute poverty, as a result of COVID. Do we want to be part of that? I don't think so. I don't either. Now we have the solution. We have probably the best business plan in front of us, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals, which is this plan, as I talked about, to use these 15 years to irreversibly eradicate poverty, which is at the root, probably, of most of the evil that we see in this world. And doing it in a more sustainable and equitable way goes by itself. It's not a battle between man and nature. Nature will survive, man will die or disappear. It's a battle for our own survival that we need to get into our heads. And that's what we need to address. The Sustainable Development Goals, which deal with poverty alleviation, food security, climate change, protecting the land, the forests, peace and justice, a different way of partnership, because these issues are too big to do for each of us alone. That's all in the Sustainable Development Goals. If you look at 4 areas, health and well-being, changing our mobility systems, food and land use, and transforming our energy systems, we looked at that for these 10 years, from 2020 to 2030. It would provide an opportunity to unlock $12 trillion of economic growth and create 380 million jobs. It would create a future that we could live in. These are enormous opportunities. Just with COVID alone, we've spent $17 trillion in Europe and the US to save lives and livelihoods, and we're nowhere near out of the woods. Kristalina from the IMF estimates that we've lost about $27 trillion in global GDP over this decade. You know what COVID has shown us? Is that the cost of not acting is actually higher than the cost of acting. So when the cost of not acting is higher than the cost of acting, it actually becomes an enormous opportunity. Now it's very clear that governments and multilateral institutions aren't quite working the way they were designed. Most of these multilateral institutions were designed at the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, when the world looked quite different than today. 85% of the global economy, or 90%, was in Europe and the US. The institutions that we created mirrored that. Of course the world has moved on, but these global institutions are kind of static. Any business would have had 10, 15, 20 new strategies. We haven't had one for multilateral cooperation. Now that the issues become more global, cybersecurity, pandemics, financial markets, and climate change, we're testing a system that isn't really designed to deliver anymore. So we can be cynical about that. And we can say the politicians this and the politicians that. Because increasingly, by not addressing the issues, the people, the citizens of this world, us, are getting mad. And increasingly, we see populists, nationalists, xenophobics running these countries. We've never been in such a poor state of global governance. But is that a reason to run away from the problem? Or are you here at the business school to actually help solve the problem? Business itself is 65% of the global economy, 80% of the world's job creation, and 95% of the financial flow. It is impossible to solve these issues if business doesn't step up and fill that void. It is impossible to be able to ensure that this world is lifted out of poverty and these sustainable development goals implemented, these 17 goals, if business doesn't get actively involved. Business needs the sustainable development goals. There's no question about it. There's no business case in poverty. But on the other hand, the sustainable development goals also need business for its innovations, for its financing, for its resources. That should be very clear to anybody. So what we are seeing since COVID, and I'll hand it over to Andrew, what we're seeing in COVID is that actually more people in this world have realized that these challenges need to be addressed at a faster pace than we were doing it. At the time before COVID, about 20% of the countries in this world made a commitment on climate change to be net zero by 2050 or 2060. As you well know, that's needed to stay below the 1.5 degrees warming. We frankly can't afford to go above that. It would be a disaster. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is exponential. It's not just a half a degree. You saw the IPCC report, perhaps, that came out this week, on that half of the world's population is exposed now to climate change. If you think we have a problem now, wait till tomorrow when we hit the 1.5 degrees. Read the facts, read the science. 99% of the people are in agreement with that. These IPCC reports, by the way, are signed off by all the countries in the world, including some of the climate-denying countries. This is science. We should certainly respect that. So we're up against time. We only have 10 years, basically, to halve our emissions and start going. Now, what happened since COVID? Was a moment of reflection, was a moment of pause, was a moment of realization of what is happening in this world. Unlike the financial crisis, when we actually never addressed the real issues, We only built out the banks. At that time, people felt banks were too big to fail and people were too small to matter. We missed an enormous opportunity. At COVID, it was slightly different. 20% of the countries before COVID had made a net zero commitment. Now, it's 95% of global emission. 65% of countries have made a net zero commitment. Hardly any companies had aggressive plans. Now we have 15% of the business community, which is not bad, coming in with plans. $130 trillion of money under management, half the world's money, signed a commitment in Glasgow at the COP26, which is called the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, to decarbonize their portfolios in line with the Paris Agreement. And obviously, the citizens of this world are asking for that. The employees in companies are asking for that. Our children are asking for that. Because it's starting to make sense. And rapidly, the financial market is moving from seeing this as a threat or a risk or a reputational issue to an enormous opportunity. And guess what? Increasingly, they're putting their money into companies that position themselves better for the future, that are well positioned with their products and their strategies for this greener, more inclusive world that we aspire to. Companies like Tesla having a market cap as big as all the others. Companies like Ørsted having a market cap bigger than the Exxons or the Mobiles. Companies that come in food and have regenerative agriculture or alternative food. By the way, a big climate emission is coming from the food chain, getting enormous market values in a short period of time. In fact, what we find is that companies that are more purpose-driven now, that operate under the longer term, try to satisfy all of their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, are actually getting a higher return, are actually more resilient, are better placed for that future. People from schools like this want to work for companies with a purpose. The employees are more motivated. The relationships in the value chain with your stakeholders are more resilient. These companies are probably more aware of these issues in the world, so they're a little bit smarter to look at these opportunities. All of that translates into better performance. The train has left the station. What we now need to do is to accelerate and to be sure that we don't miss that window that is given to us, a unique opportunity, to be sure that these conflicts that I was talking about don't get in the way to address these major issues that are at the roots of these conflicts in the first place. To not get tied up on the symptoms alone, but to start to work on the underlying causes. To work on the forest, not just only in the forest. And that requires a mindset change, that requires a leadership change. And here is the leader, Andrew, to talk about it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I really enjoy the opportunity to speak to students. I work with a lot of large companies. I talk to executives, people like Paul, all the time. And I will say the thing that's driving change the most in business, I mean, certainly climate, companies feel it. They're feeling it from investors. But when you ask them what's really driving it, it's actually the pressure from younger people as consumers, but mainly as employees. So the pressure that you can apply as you come out of school and you go work is critical to making the change happen. So I think you heard what Paul described perfectly was a very volatile world. That's the world that we're in now. That's the world that we tried to put some ideas into the world. Now, Paul talked about you can't go halfway to the moon. Writing a book is kind of half, maybe not even half the story. The next half is actually trying to get the ideas out there, bringing it to young people, bringing it to schools, bringing it to business, and letting them work with it and evolve with it and teach us what's right about it, what needs changing. So I want to give you just a quick taste of the book itself, of the ideas, so that when we get into kind of Q&A, and I guess some of you are going to be assigned to this. I apologize for that. You're going to have to do work and write papers and things, that you understand kind of where we're coming from. That the idea from what you just heard from Paul is that the pressures are big and we have to go much, much faster, especially on climate, but everything has this pressure behind it. And a net positive business, the way we're defining it, is one that profits and thrives, and it's important we say that, that this is not just some sacrifice, this is not corporate social responsibility. This is how a business will profit, is by solving the world's problems, not creating them. And the question that we are fundamentally asking is the world better off because your business is in it? And I find companies, this kind of stops them. And people have really found this to be a very tough question to answer for their business and for themselves. And you heard a little bit from Paul about the core principles of this kind of business. Being long-term focused is at the core. And that goes against the direct pressure that companies feel from investors, from really everyone. Being multiple stakeholder, meaning you're not just serving shareholders, you're trying to improve the well-being of everybody that you impact. And for a multinational, that's basically everyone. Employees, customers and consumers, communities, suppliers, everyone. And shareholders then become an important stakeholder. By solving problems for others, then you make money for shareholders. This reverses the way we've been focused for 50 years. The neoliberal economic order says shareholders come first. The only measure that matters in a company is really profits, maybe their stock price. The only measure that matters at the national level is GDP, and maybe stock price. And you have to believe in the transformative nature of partnership. These problems are so big you cannot deal with them alone. But the core principle that really distinguishes a net positive business is taking ownership. And so I want to talk very quickly about what that looks like. Now, many of you might be familiar with what's called the greenhouse gas protocol. And it's the way companies talk about their carbon footprint, specifically that one big aspect of their impact on the world. There's 3 levels. One is the direct emissions, so if you're burning oil or gas on site, that's scope 1. The next level up is emissions from the grid, the electricity you're buying. And then scope 3, which is where companies are now getting to really, is the emissions of their supply chain and their customers. And this is an important kind of mental extension to have companies think about that full view. But it's not the only view. And a number of people have written that there's more levels. And we kind of took this idea and ran with it in the book and said, you have more than just these 3. You are having an impact as a sector, and this is how you get into discussions of regenerative business models or circular business models. That has to happen at the sector level. You have an influence on policy, either directly walking into DC or Brussels or other world capitals, or through silence and letting trade associations go and talk about policy for you. And then at the largest level, every company has some impact on, say, consumption, if you're a consumer products company, or our reliance on fossil fuels. That's the largest level. And you can do this exercise not just for kind of carbon footprint, which is more the obvious one today, but all dimensions of your performance, including the people side. So let's say you're a food and ag business. You care about your safety, the employee safety, you care about their well-being. This is kind of common practice. But increasingly, companies need to worry about the farm workers, the food workers back in the value chain, the communities that they're in. Are they thriving? Are you supporting the kinds of policies as a company that gets us to regenerative agriculture? We can't just state we're going to go there. We need policy and systemic change. Are you supporting policies that will fight food waste, help with nutrition? And at the largest level, if you're a food business, how are we going to feed 9 or 10 billion people within the limits of the planet? These are the big questions. And it can sound really daunting for a company to take these on, but they can't do it alone, and they don't have to do it alone. And it's part of this larger question of what can we do for the world, and how are we going to lead? I mean, imagine a world where food and agriculture is actually sequestering carbon. They're part of the solution. Where social media companies are actually helping people find truth and support democracy. Where the banks are providing better service for the poor than the rich and only funding the clean economy instead of fossil fuels. That's what a net positive company starts to look like. And you heard from Paul, and I think you see an example of what a leader looks like, that you need to have a different set of principles behind you as a leader. Courage is really the big one. It takes courage to say to Wall Street, we're not going to talk to you every quarter. We want to think in the long run. It takes courage and humility to go to the intelligence quotient or emotional quotient, but decency quotient, a DQ, where you bring humanity to your job. You bring it to work. And I think that's one of the core aspects of net positives, that you bring humanity. So how do you do this? A couple just tactical examples, and then we'll sit down and kind of talk both big and small picture. Part of it is thinking much differently, and you heard about the Sustainable Development Goals, but bringing that into a company means you're setting goals differently. You're setting goals that are in line with the external thresholds. And the leading companies that are setting what we'd call net positive goals are thinking very large. So you have Microsoft and Google, who have goals like, we will sequester carbon equal to all the carbon we've emitted since we were founded. That's like a retroactive neutrality. It's very clever. Or we will power our data centers by 2030, this is a Google goal, with just renewable energy, meaning on-site energy, storage, and if we plug into the grid, it has to be entirely clean also. And that leads you to partnerships and innovation. You can't change the grid alone. This is how you get to the partnership idea. And this is the core of the book, really, and the core of the idea. And so just a couple quick examples of what does partnership look like. You can partner with your supply chain. Apple has a really innovative partnership with Alcoa and Rio Tinto to develop a new kind of aluminum that has a low footprint. And so why am I showing a car? Well, Apple bought the first batch of this aluminum so they could start to move towards zero carbon in all their devices. But Apple, as big as it is not a large user of aluminum compared to cars and buildings and planes. So the second batch of this new aluminum was bought by Audi for the tires, the wheels of an electric car. This is what net positive looks like. Apple started to create a ripple that affects the auto industry. And in the past, this wouldn't have been on their minds. This wouldn't have been part of their job. But this is what partnership looks like and how you expand your thinking. Unilever's been famous for having partnerships that have been effective to bring well-being to 1 billion people. That was one of their goals when Paul started the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan in 2010. And we've talked about this being a business issue, not a philanthropic issue. But probably the biggest partnership that maybe any company's had has been Unilever and UNICEF, bringing hand-washing events to people all over the world. And they have reached about 1 billion kids and new mothers. And that sounds philanthropic, but this is really core to the brand, the Lifebuoy soap brand. That is one of the first brands from Unilever's history. It's 150 years old, this brand. And it was kind of a stagnant brand. It wasn't really growing. And then they increased the focus on these hand-washing events. And this was just part of how the brand faces the world. It wasn't a philanthropic effort. This was part of how they go out into the world. And yes, they taught kids how to reduce the exposure to diseases that could kill them. They saved millions of lives. But from a business perspective, it also drove innovation. They were teaching kids to wash hands for 30 seconds to kill the germs. But it turns out that in some places there's not enough water for that. And kids, if anybody has them, they don't sit still for 30 seconds very well. So it drove innovation to develop a new kind of soap that lasted for 10 seconds before it killed. 10 seconds is all it took, and it changed color. So the kids knew they were done. This is value from values. This is growth of the business and solving global problems. In the book, we kind of build to, I think, one really critical story that gets at the largest idea behind partnership, which is systems change. And we talk about palm oil. This is one of the most complicated issues in the world. Palm oil is in a lot of the food we eat, most of the products that we put on our bodies, and it's one of the most traded and controlled substances in the world. It's in so many things. And it's the reason Indonesia is one of the largest emitters of carbon, much more than its size of its GDP would suggest, because people are cutting down forests to grow more palm oil. And the large companies that buy it, Unilever was the largest buyer in the world, still is. The largest buyers had tried to fix this problem for years, and frankly, they failed. And so what changed? In the last 4 years, deforestation rates have actually dropped. It's one of the few bright spots on the carbon goals. Why? Well, they finally got the whole system together. It wasn't just the buyers and the processors. They got down at the jurisdictional level with the farmers, the municipalities, the government. They brought in NGOs like Greenpeace that had better ideas and better practices. And then finally also brought in money. So Unilever and the Norwegian Sovereign Fund put money in so that farmers had financing to move to better practices, different species, and could double the productivity on their farms. So they didn't need to cut down the next hectare. This is what the solutions look like. It's hard work. It is getting everyone at the table. This is how you build healthy forests a healthy environment for the animals, healthy for the farmers. This is how we build a healthy, thriving world, coming together in these very difficult partnerships where the scale grows. And the fundamental principle behind everything that we'll say, probably for the next hour, is that business cannot thrive unless people and planet are thriving as well. So I ask you to consider, as you go out into the world today and for the rest of your time in school, how are you going to be net positive? How will you bring that to the organizations that you're in, to your school, to your families, to your jobs? How are you going to be net positive? And I want to invite up Peter to talk to us. I was going to give you another minute, but I think you covered it, unless you want to say something in closing.
Covered it, and we can get going. But you know, we've talked about the need for companies to step up and to really become positive. Profiting from solving the world's problems, not creating the world's problems. That's not an easy thing. Andrew has talked about the need for partnerships in your own value chains, but also with society, to change the systems around us so that we can make it more inclusive. But above all, it's about leadership. And he's used the word courage. Courage is actually coming from the French word cœur, that is heart. Leading with the heart and the brain. What we're talking about here really is bringing humanity back to business. What we've seen with COVID once more is that the leaders that do best are the leaders that are humble, that are showing a high level of humanity, operate with compassion and humility, have a strong sense of purpose, understand the power of partnership, think multi-generational. These are the type of leaders that have been successful, not surprisingly, because they instill trust in their people. And trust is probably the biggest currency that we need right now. You are these type of leaders. You are these purpose-driven individuals. I've never been so short of them. So my final message to you is very simple. It's what the Dalai Lama actually said when he said that if you seek enlightenment just for yourselves, to enhance your own purposes, so your own objectives, you actually miss purpose. But if you seek enlightenment to help others achieve their objectives, you actually live a life with purpose. Leadership ultimately is not only about being a good human being, but more importantly, it is to firmly understand that putting yourself to the service of others unselfishly, unconditionally, will actually also be to your ultimate benefit as well. Unfortunately, too many people in this world still think that greed is good, but ultimately, generosity will win. So be these purposeful leaders, and Peter, join us on stage.
I think
Maybe I should do it.
You would.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew and Paul, for what has been an amazing conference so far. And we're going to take now the next hour or so together with you to get through the questions that matter. And I think, Paul, you talked about how we should not do unto others what we wouldn't want to be done upon ourselves. It's one of the things you talk about in the book. That's the golden rule, I believe you call it. And I think we cannot talk about net positive. We cannot talk about how business can help make the world better without also acknowledging that, of course, right now in the world, one of the major things we are seeing is conflict and war. We've seen that under your leadership at Unilever, the decade that passed. You've seen war in Syria, in Libya. You've seen it in Israel and Palestine. You've seen internal conflicts in countries like the United States, Black Lives Matter, in France. You've seen it, of course, today, the war in Ukraine. And so my question to you is, if you are leading Unilever today, or if you are leading a multinational company today, what would your reaction be?
Well, first of all, businesses cannot succeed in societies that fail. So you are an inherent part of a system that allows you to operate, which requires you, if you want to be around long term, that you operate in a responsible way. So the first thing is that if you run a business, it's not about just the shareholder or amassing money for a few people. It is about serving society. The essence of this book, of a net positive company, is in fact a company that takes responsibility of its total impact in society, its total handprint, all consequences intended or not. So when you live in a world where
this because you talk about handprint, could you please tell us what that means, a handprint?
Well, that means is that if you live in a world as a business and you're participating in a world that still has these many issues that are at the roots of some of these conflicts that you talk about, they are always at the roots of the conflicts that you talk about, that business needs to be sure that they are not perpetuating these issues, that they are actually actively trying to solve it. So first of all is put humanity first. This ultimately is about human development. This is not about climate change or food security or, air pollution. This ultimately is about ensuring that each and everybody can develop themselves, can be included, and that we do that in a way that respects planet Earth and future generations. So business has a responsibility. Any business that operates to a certain extent in a way that still causes climate change, or that drives inequality, or that doesn't take care of human rights in its value chain, is actually a business that contributes to these issues that we are seeing today. And that needs to be very firmly into the heads of all these CEOs. I mean, a CEO position is a very privileged position. Also gets overpaid, in my opinion. But we need to have the standards high of what we expect from these people. Otherwise, why would we have these companies run around? Now, it's not easy what we're saying. One of the things that Andrew alluded to, but because you have to be, as you try to implement this, consistent in all what you do. So how do you deal with corruption? How do you deal with money in politics? How do you deal with trade associations lobbying different things than you say? How do you deal with CEO salaries? If we are not consistent and fair and transparent about what we do, we will never build that trust that is absolutely crucial to forge these broader partnerships to address these bigger issues. Yeah. And this has to be a responsibility. The sad thing, obviously, of this human tragedy unfolding in Eastern Europe right now, there's no question about it, that this is a drastic step back for humanity and actually slides us back on the Sustainable Development Goals. But the good thing in all of this is that I think people are starting to realize that this is not the way to get to a more inclusive and equitable world. You see companies now stepping up at ways that we've not seen before. You see countries working together that previously were not working together. So can we turn this into something good to prevent this evil from spreading or happening, and actually learn from that to do the same in other parts of the world, as you rightfully alluded to, is absolutely important. We have to come out stronger here, not weaker. This is actually a crucial moment for humanity, where we are dealing with climate change, where we're dealing with democracy or inclusion, where we're dealing with the pandemic still at the same time. It is tough to be a CEO, but if we don't now rise to that higher challenge, we not only miss a window of opportunity, I think we will soon discover that we're starting to miss humanity.
You mentioned this also in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, I saw in the presentation also, Andrew, of course, peace, preserving peace, is a Sustainable Development Goal. All these topics are interlinked.
Yeah, totally.
You've heard Paul say about what CEOs can do. But when it comes to the situation unfolding in Ukraine now, can they do more?
Well, let me just add some context, which is over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been more change in what's expected of business. And we kind of alluded to all this, but the pressure on business to have a position on the world's problems, I think it's changed more in the last couple of years than the 20 I've been doing this. Yeah. Climate was there, inequality was there, but now, for whatever combination of reasons, the pandemic made companies, they had to make some hard choices about short-term profits or going to build ventilators together in a coalition and spending money and trying to make sure their people were paid and all sorts of things. And some companies made wrong decisions, but I think most kind of stepped up. And then the murder of George Floyd was a tipping point in the U.S., clearly, but was surprising to me. There were protests all over the world.
The Black Lives Matter
movement.
Right.
The movements have made it so CEOs, kind of personally, but companies have to put out statements now about racial equity, climate inequality, LGBTQ rights, democracy protection, fact and truth, the attack on truth with misinformation, and something like Ukraine. You have to say something now. And so far, we've been looking at the CEO statements in the last few days because they're coming out fast now. Frankly, a lot of them are not very good. They're pretty light. They're almost old-fashioned. They'll say, "Oh, we are with it's the thoughts and prayers. You know, we are with the people of Ukraine, and we will help our employees donate if they want to." That just doesn't seem like enough for what is. The war on democracy, the war on individual freedoms and the ability to be represented yourself, not by an autocratic leader. That war just went from cold to hot, but it's been going on, right? There's been misinformation to drive a wedge into the democratic process. It now went hot, and I think companies, again, you can't thrive as a business in a planet that's undergoing some version of World War III or some undermining of freedoms. Business needs to step up far more. And you're seeing the leading companies say, okay, we're going to pull business out of Russia. These are not easy decisions because the people of Russia are affected, right, and hurt. But companies are trying to find this balance, but just saying we think and we care, I think just doesn't cut it.
And I just want to ask, Paul and Andrew, you have been around a long time, of course, especially compared to most of the students
not that long.
here.
It's not that long. Yeah.
Andrew longer than I have.
Yeah, okay. Noted.
Thank you. You look good for your age.
Thank you. That's because of the dinner yesterday night.
Yeah, that was. Yeah.
But
the food
of course,
here is amazing, by the way.
You take a stance here, but you've been around for a long time, and you alluded to the fact it's no longer acceptable. Can you just reiterate this point that, whether it's COVID or climate change or inequality or poverty or war, that you've seen that change in your lifetime, in your career?
No, absolutely. I think if you're referring to the stance that businesses need to take, over 75% of people expect businesses to take a position. And you have to be careful when and where and how all these things are understood. But, when democracy gets undermined and you don't speak up, your employees start to worry if you're really serious about it yourself. When a murder of George Floyd happens and you don't take a position and backed up by real action, employees start to worry if you want to work for these companies, or people start to worry if they want to buy from those companies. So the pressure now on CEOs to also become societal leaders is absolutely much higher than it is. I want to come back to goal number 16, which is peace and justice, which deals exactly with the issue, Peter, that you talk about. You know that currently in this world, we spent about $12 trillion on wars. 10 to 12% of our global economy goes to conflict prevention and wars. Just think about that. I just want to put one number in your mind. That is about 3 times more than what we need to spend on implementing the sustainable development goals. So we are willing to spend 3 times more on dealing with the consequences than what it would cost to avoid them in the first place. And then we call ourselves the most intelligent species. It just doesn't add up. And this is what we need to make people aware of, that if we can repurpose that money, to be frank, to address these issues in the first place, we don't have to deal with that, and we create this better world. So we're at that point now. And business gets these costs into their P&Ls. Increasingly, they are aware of that. And frankly, because of the precarious situations politicians find themselves in, society actually increasingly expects business to take that role. Business actually has a higher trust with society than the politicians. It's sad, it shouldn't be a competition. It's nothing to celebrate. The trust is still lower than I would want it to be, but at least step up. If you don't step up, step away.
Yeah. And that is the world, of course, that all of you are entering into, a role where people rightly expect of business to do more. And Andrew, of course, there are, 17, I think, sustainable development goals. So that's a lot to choose from for business. What would you say among them is the most important one to choose, to act on?
Well, as you mentioned, there's peace. There's kind of 2 meta goals, right, over the other. There's really 15 kind of categories of improving the social and environmental status and improving footprint. And peace and partnership are kind of overlaying. So it's kind of easy to say partnership, right? It's the core of the message we have, because without it, you're not going to get the others. And I don't think there's a most important of the others. I think companies are going through a process of figuring out the material issues, that's the more technical, accounting term, and picking the ones they can have the most impact on. But I've found for years that companies will say, well, we can't act on everything. When the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan launched, it had one of the most diverse set of goals of any plan. It was really one of the first plans like it, and had 50 plus targets. And I've worked with companies for years, like, we can't have 50 targets. We can't have targets in all those categories. Well, you can, because it's not one person responsible for it. It's a multinational. There's different people with different parts. The SDGs are basically saying we can't have a functioning world without fundamentally these 15 categories of outcomes moving in the right direction. And they're all interrelated. So I think there's most important ones for given sectors, right? Yeah. I think the food and ag business has got to work on hunger more than others, but all have to work on climate. All have to work on, I think, livelihoods. There is no one most important. I just want to add quickly one, because we've been talking in pretty depressing terms, that one optimistic note about the last years is, so I have been in this 20 years, I've seen a couple recessions, and colleagues and friends like John Elkington in the UK, who's been in it more like 40 years, in every past recession or slowdown or world issue, like the meltdown in 2008, sustainability takes a back seat. The companies literally fire people, they shrink those departments. That didn't happen this time. The pandemic hit, and interest in sustainability accelerated.
We saw it here in Barcelona, more bike lanes, more green.
At the city level, it accelerated, but just at the company level. And now there are endless job postings. The war for talent, for anybody who knows anything about what's called ESG now, or sustainability, is happening all over the world. One of the organizations I'm on the board of, we were talking about their Asian operation. They can't get people because there's so much competition for both in-company and consultants. And this is good news for anybody wanting to go out into the world. But it means it's not even just those jobs with sustainability in the title. It means companies are trying to find people throughout the business, throughout NGOs, throughout government, who have some sense of these issues and knowledge. And that, to me, showed that we had hit a tipping point, that we're not going back. It doesn't matter if any one company, including Unilever, loses some of its motion on sustainability. It's too big a movement now. This is the first time I can say that in 20 years.
And that's amazing. And so I think we're seeing that movement towards net positive, wanting to have a positive handprint on society, as you say, Paul. But of course, we have a legacy where, as you said, we have destroyed a lot of things too in the past, during your lifetime, in the last 75 years or 100 years. So is it ever possible for a company like Unilever, any company really, to have a positive impact if it also produces waste, if it also has emissions, if it also causes obesity? I mean, how is it possible to do it all?
You see, it's I think collectively is the word, and that's why one of the things we talk about is it takes three to tango. These challenges are enormously tough, and Unilever alone would not be in a position to stop the world's deforestation or plastics in the ocean or human rights violations that are happening. But collectively, we certainly could. Nature itself, the planet itself, is regenerative, restorative, reparative. The whole concept of waste is an invention by human beings. When at Unilever, I told my factory manager we're going to run all of our factories at zero waste to landfill, his first reaction was, it can't be done.
You told him we're going to do zero waste to landfill. Zero waste,
because, waste, the word waste already makes me nervous. So waste is a human design that has crept in by laziness, because we didn't value the negative externalities that came with it, because we had an abundancy, because there weren't that many people yet in the world, and the planet sort of compensated for that. But we can't afford it now anymore. So let's not be critical of the past. We've just discovered that it can't continue, so that is why we need to put our energy against that change. But I said, take 5 years, let me know how much it is. But I just don't think it's a good thing to operate with waste. It only took them 3 years. It didn't cost any money. Actually, we saved money. The factories became more motivated. The quality of customer service or of our products went up. So if you look at these things holistically, you can actually solve a lot of things, often at the design stage, and that's why you need a few years. The same right now with many of these challenges that you allude to, when the cost of not acting once more that is higher than the cost of acting, I think it's quite an incentive to start to change. You know, take obesity. 3/4 of the world's healthcare costs go actually treating the symptoms. Diabetes too is now the biggest pandemic that this world has. Isn't it better that we, instead of calling it healthcare, it's not healthcare, because you're sick. That's where we spend the money. So we should really spend it on healthcare, which is preventative.
Yeah.
And companies that are starting to do that, governments, systems that encourage that, I think would be better off. Nature. Our food system is probably the most broken thing we've invented on Earth. We cut down forests, we keep the smallholder farmer poor, the 160 million children a year stunted because they don't get enough nutrition in their first 1,000 days. We have the courage or audacity to waste 30 to 40% of the food. And on the other hand, it's this obesity. And by the way, I've forgotten to mention that even today, 826 million people go to bed hungry every night, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. So that's not a system that is very intelligent. If you now come from Mars and you look at our food system, you must think we're nuts. Yeah. So, but the cost is tremendous now. The negative externalities of our food system, which we are paying in other areas, is about $12 trillion. And we could correct that with limited amounts of money, often getting rid of perverse subsidies and some other things, some little investments here or there. But it's not much. We know how to produce food without degrading the land or cutting down the forest. We know how to not waste things. So, but it needs these new partnerships with government, with civil society, with business to get together to solve that. That's the essence of what obviously the WEF is trying to do, bringing people together. But with this book, we're trying to create this mindset of the business of really move into that direction. It's hard work, but move your businesses there and you'll be very well positioned. So yes, it can be done. And increasingly we see companies moving. Walmart making commitments on protecting 1 million square miles of the ocean, Nestle and Unilever regenerative agriculture, Microsoft taking carbon out of the air since going back to 1975. Companies like MasterCard that you mentioned, putting $500 million in there to help minorities in the US come into the value chain. PayPal's ensuring that there is financial inclusion for everybody. So yes, you can think that regenerative, net positive way.
It's positive, and I see it also. I think, I don't know if you guys have been here long enough, but when I used to come to Barcelona, you could buy these 6 packs of beer, and they would have these plastic things keeping them together. And now it's of course made of carton. The plastic bags have been replaced by paper bags. So you see that it is positive.
Yeah. As long as the beer is there.
As long as the beer is there. But the question is, of course, where does it end, right? Yeah. And Andrew, you also talk in the book about things like Patagonia or KLM, who are saying, don't buy this sweater this Christmas, or don't fly to your relatives, take the train or so. That's basically almost getting into degrowth, stopping growth. Yeah. Is that then the answer, or is it possible to grow and to do it in a positive way?
Well, this growth question is really the core challenge, right? It's because some things have to grow. If I take population as a given, like an exogenous variable, like it's going to happen. Because there's some people say, we should not grow. Population is going to grow. We're going to get to 9 or 10 billion before we level off, probably as a species. So I feel like we have to figure out the answer. And right now, we're overusing resources. Paul likes to talk about the Earth Overshoot Day, which last year I think was July 29th, where that's at that point in the year we had used basically all of the interest in assets that the world provides. After that, we're drawing down capital, natural capital, and we're taking from the future. So how we're doing it now is broken, but we're going to have to see growth. So there's some answers that make sense, and some are kind of a cop-out. Decoupling is one of the big answers, which is you decouple material wealth and growth from material stuff. So using renewable energy, not fossil fuels, so that you can start to bring energy to places in the world that don't have it, and leapfrog in technologies, the way we did with mobile. I think this is still true. A few years ago, there were more mobile phones in India than toilets, although Unilever's been working hard to make sure there's more toilets. And so we leapfrog in technologies, and we can do that. But there's a larger problem, that the world is one set of thresholds, right? There's only so much stuff. And so I think we're going to have to see degrowth in some sense in the richest part of the world. I think the conversation that's going to be really hard is the 1 billion of us that have produced almost all the historic emissions, are using almost all of the material now, to allow for the rest of the world to grow and improve their well-being. I think we have to have a conversation. And it doesn't mean necessarily sacrifice. As people eat less meat and find other things they enjoy to eat, they're reducing their footprint. It might not be a big sacrifice. As they drive less or live closer to work, maybe their lives are better. You know, like there's ways that this is better, but I do think it's a hard conversation. And there's a quote in the book from Gandhi that says, the rich must live simply so the poor can simply live. And I think that's the hard conversation to have. But it's really difficult with business. If you're a CEO of a public company, how do you go out and say, oh, we're going to not grow? Like and you need growth of some of the things that we're talking about. The program with UNICEF, with Unilever. Yeah. You want that to be bigger. It's reaching more people. It's helping save lives. So you need the things that are helping to grow, and you need to shrink the things that are not. And this is the big challenge. And you're only going to do this together in systems. There's no other way.
So you have to grow, and you sort of have to lean into, also growing in places where maybe things aren't going great yet. Unilever is active in what, 150 countries? Yeah. How do you deal with that?
So you have to define growth, otherwise you'll have separate discussions going at different levels. In Unilever, we made a commitment to decouple our growth from environmental impact. We actually achieved that and much more.
That means decoupling. So
that means you redefine growth, actually. See, if we define growth as just producing more stuff, it's not going to work because we have a finite planet. We don't have more stuff. There's only so many little chemicals that we can put together. In fact, we're losing some because we're shooting it to space. Most of these billionaires have discovered it's better to live on the moon than on the Earth. That's why they're doing it. So we need to redefine what success looks like. And as long as we define success with making more stuff and owning more stuff and having more cars and more land mowers and bigger houses, it is not going to work. But isn't it better that we focus on quality of education or peace or air we can breathe or the forests we can walk in or the land that are fertile to give us nutritious food versus being depleted? Or no violence in the streets when we walk around at night? None of that is in GDP. And yet it's incredibly valuable to us. So we need to move to just get a return on financial capital to also include returns on social and environmental capital. When Simon Kushnick in the early 60s invented the word GDP,
Gross Domestic
Product, it was meant to be a measure of industrial output. We just come from World War II. We were a steel producing economy, the Industrial Revolution. It was all about output as a measure of how a country was doing. But he put a warning on there. And the guy was smart enough to say, please don't use this as a measure of success. You're chasing the wrong measure. It doesn't include income inequality. It doesn't include the negative externalities. It doesn't include the finite resources that we talked about.
Household work done.
So increasingly, countries in the world are looking at a broader definition of a development index, of a well-being index, of a happiness index, and you're starting to see that. And in fact, the most important announcement that was made at Glasgow at the COP26, where I spent most of my time,
the climate conference in November last year,
advising the UK government. But most of one of the bigger announcements that was made was the establishment of the Sustainable Standard Board. Because at the end of the day, in our system, we treasure what we measure. And if we make these capitalists more aware of other things they need to measure and held accountable for, we can pivot that system. And then we redefine growth in terms of these planetary boundaries, and then we can indeed grow.
You say we treasure what we measure. And so right now in companies, we measure things like your quarterly growth, your profit, but you could also measure other things.
As long as you value a tree that is dead more than a tree that is alive, we are in trouble. It's as simple as that. Yeah. If we don't measure the social capital that we have, which is actually what makes our economies grow, or environmental capital, human capital, if we don't measure these things, we will never value them. Right now, unfortunately, business uses $45 trillion of nature-based services. Nature-based services, together are worth over $125 trillion, more than the global economy, but we don't seem to value it. So put a price on that. That's why we are advocating, for example, for a price on carbon. With a price on carbon, you'll see faster conversion to green energy.
And you've done that at Unilever.
At Unilever, because the governments didn't do it, we just put an internal price. And that money that we actually charged ourselves was an internal price, $30, $40, because you go up. That actually was invested in projects that accelerated the green conversion. Unilever was one of the first companies to make commitments to be net zero before people really understood that concept. We did it in 2030, we actually achieved it now already. And partly that was because I was actively involved in the COP21 to be sure that that agreement was there. So seeing the science, seeing the challenges, but also these opportunities, allowed us with a certain level of confidence to internalize that.
Now, of course, these students here, they will go into the job market and, rightfully, I think, hope for career growth and also income growth. Is that then something that they should idealistically give up? Or do you say, well, it's okay to aim for higher incomes?
Well, there's been surveys for years that show, and another just came out recently, surveying business students around the world. And they always show in the polls that they will take a pay cut for a more sustainable job. So you guys say that, but how many really will do that? I always wonder, when the job offer comes, is that really going to happen? But I think it's a way of saying that part of the calculus now is that you find meaning in your work. And that, I went to Boston Consulting Group right out of college. I did that typical thing. I had an economics degree. And that's still, at many universities, they're still heading to banks and consulting firms. It's still such a big deal, in part because there's so much debt, right? There's so much school debt, so that they have to pay it. I guess I hope that if that continues and they're going to places that are highly paid, that they go to those jobs with sustainability in their mindset and wanting to help through their job. Because even though there's growth in sustainability jobs, not everyone can have those jobs. So I guess it's easy to say you don't necessarily have to sacrifice if you want to go down a more highly paid job route, as long as you're bringing your values and a sense of what the world really needs into that job. We're not going to get there, just like Paul said earlier, we can't get there without business. We can't get there without the banks, right? So if you're going to go down the most highly paid route, you're still going to need that sector to be supporting the
so we
pathway.
All need that mindset. And
why do you want to work for something that makes things worse for your children and your grandchildren? Just tell me. Why do you want to work for companies that destroy planet Earth when we only have one? It just doesn't make sense. Yeah. In the US, you see, and perhaps it made sense in the past in a way because we weren't aware of it. But now we are aware of it. In the US, you see the great resignation now. Millions of people walking out of companies. They don't want to work there anymore. Of course, they need a minimum on the Maslow hierarchy, but they want to be part of something bigger. They want to make this world better than how they found it. They want to leave it for their future generations. They want to respect planet Earth. They understand. Generation Z and millennials are there. We're talking to ourselves here if we keep talking on this. They're there. And companies will discover that they just aren't able to attract the talent, which is at the essence of a company's success. And we're starting to see that happen. There's a direct correlation between engagement scores in companies and companies' financial success.
And you see it at Unilever. People wanted to work more at Unilever than at any other comparable firm.
When we started the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, we were surprised because Unilever is not a brand, but we were the third most looked up company after Apple and Google on LinkedIn. We got 2 million people applying to us every year. In most countries that we operated, we became the preferred employer. But the more important data for us was actually the internal engagement scores. We were in the middle sort of when we started the journey, and the company had to also business-wise do better. And then we found ourselves fairly quickly in the top of the top tercile. And ultimately, that gave me confidence. I always looked at two things when I went around the countries. I looked at diversity. I wanted to be 100% diverse, and I really appreciate that you have here 54% women in school. But Unilever became fairly quickly a diverse company. It's now 50%. By the way, one of the conditions when I came was that the board was 50% women, 50% men. So we did that from the beginning. But I always looked at diversity. Are we making progress in all its senses? And I looked at the employer brand.
Yeah.
Because these are probably the drivers, and then obviously the values, because these are the drivers that make your company successful long term. I didn't need to look at the distribution of our products, or if our pricing is on strategy, or if our product quality is right. Of course we wanted that, but I'm sure there are enough smart people that could figure that out. But these are the key drivers of what make businesses successful.
How did you get those insights, Paul? Because, when you were 20, was this always your plan, that you were going to lead a global company towards net positive? I mean, where does this all come from?
No, I never wanted to be a CEO, actually. I never wanted to be in business. I'm a little bit of a CEO by accident. But, and the title doesn't mean anything anyway either. I mean, we can all call ourselves CEOs if we want to feel better about that. But what I found is that the more I was in business, and I was very fortunate to work for Procter & Gamble, then Nestle, then Unilever, all of these three companies at board level. I don't think we'll see that anymore. But that these were companies with strong values built to last. They all created their businesses in the midst of the 19th century. They take a longer-term multi-stakeholder perspective. So you get a certain level of education, not only on how to run the business or what is important in consumer goods to survive. There are some basics. You need to invest in people, in R&D, and your brands, and how you do your marketing and all the other things. But I also saw the value of these longer-term business models, the value of having strong values and then backing it up with behavior, so you create the right cultures. And so that is. But when I went to Rio, the Rio conference. Rio plus 20.
These are the other UN climate conferences in 92 and in 2012.
And then when the Secretary General, then Ban Ki-moon, asked me to help develop the Sustainable Development Goals and to be part of that from the business community, it was like drinking from a fire hose. And over my years, I had been exposed to many of the issues in society. That's the benefit of a consumer goods company. You're pretty close to consumers or citizens of this world. So you develop, you're still developing. But you go through experiences that make you realize, we grew up during the Vietnam Wars and Biafra and some of the sad things in the 60s. And frankly, my first protest in the Netherlands were atomic weapons that we still had in the Netherlands in the 60s that the Americans had put there. So we've been activists in a sense in a lot of things when we grew up. And then, you develop that. When I went to Newcastle, was the first time I saw second generation of unemployment. Shipbuilding, steel, coal had gone belly up. And the only thing a 14-year-old girl could get to get some self-respect was pregnant. And that's not a good situation to find yourself in when you're 14. So we got involved with community activities. And that helped open my mind that there is more to life than just making money. And that was in my 30s, let's say. Then I had a friend who was blind, and he called me and he says, let's climb Mount Kilimanjaro. So long story short, we said, let's go with 8 blind people from all parts of the world. So we went to the top. I found that, like Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, she said, and she was always being asked, must be terrible to be blind. And she said, no, the worst thing in the world is not being blind. The worst thing is having eyes and not being able to see. And I saw that these people saw more than we were seeing, that it's not disabilities, but diffabilities. So I created a foundation with my wife that now has 25,000 blind children in schools in Africa. So it changed my life for the 1.3 billion people with disabilities. Then I was stuck in the Taj Mahal at the terrible attack that happened there. And we lost lives around us. And for some reason our lives were spared, which I still don't understand. But I saw what poverty does and the hate of coming out of that. But then you also see the goodness of people. So you become more determined to do things when you have these crucibles in life. And that continues until it's time to move to something better, hopefully, when our time here is done.
And then, of course, as a culmination of all of that, you could say, you wrote together this book. And before we get to student questions, and you can maybe think about what you want to ask in the next 20 minutes. Andrew, how did that go? How did you guys find each other?
Only the nice parts.
The nice parts. Well, it's funny. When I was thinking when you said you can only do half, you can't go half a project. There were moments where I was halfway through the book where I'm like, I'm done. That's it. Well, Paul and I knew each other somewhat. I had done some work with Unilever in North America on their sustainability advisory board. It's part of what I do for my living. I just wanted to say, you talk about accidental CEO. I'm a completely accidental writer. I grew up, I was a quant guy. I was a math guy. I was kind of almost a math prodigy. And so I thought I was going to be all math and science. And then discovered in college, math majors had to work too hard. And so I'm serious. I sang in college and I wanted to do that more. And I did econ because it was just a much easier form of math. And really looking back how lazy that was. But I came out, and you learn everybody has to learn how to communicate and write. And I think it's like a weakness in a lot of ways in education. And the writing just kind of came out as a way to make change happen. So accidental is really big in careers, by the way. I think you don't know exactly where you're going, but you'll use everything you've done.
I've read something, by the way, that the word CEO, that it only started coming in existence in the 1960s.
Really?
So some people were born, and the word CEO didn't even exist. So they couldn't even want to be CEO because it didn't exist.
There's CSO is a new one, right? So, Paul and I knew each other a little bit. He had read some of my stuff. I wrote about Unilever more than anybody. In my previous book, The Big Pivot, I covered Unilever more than any other company. So Paul and his right-hand guy, Jeff Seabright, who we're really bummed is not here today, a brilliant sustainability officer across many companies, they approached me and said, hey, Paul's been asked to write a book repeatedly. And to his credit, Paul finds those to be kind of ego exercises if they're just a CEO book. And I think he realized it was, and he can speak for himself, but that it was a way to spread the word on the ways to do this. He gets approached so often about, well, how did you do this at Unilever? How do we do this? And needed to get the ideas out. So Paul approached me, and we started working right before the pandemic. We had our first meeting right around New Year's of 2020, and then everything locked down. And it actually, the only upside of that for me was just, you could just write. I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't traveling, and could just focus. And so we spoke, at least once a week, a couple hours, and just spent an amazing amount of time on the phone and went back and forth and round and round. And a book is an incredibly painful process, as you know. You've done it alone and with others. But I always say it's great to have written a book. It's awesome when it's out. It's just it's a very painful process. But this was incredibly fun. There were a couple moments I think we wanted to kill each other, but I think for the most part it was really rewarding, and I felt like in a way my career had led up to this moment. I'd written the books I had wanted to in sustainability, and then this opportunity came to kind of take it to a different level and bring much more of, I think what this book does that most haven't, even some of my own, is really show how it's done. Unilever and Paul had done more than any company in the world. And that's what's really needed. There's a lot of books on how capitalism has to change, business has to change, the theory, and some of them are really important works. But very few say, here's kind of the steps, here's the things that happen, here's the examples, here's how partnerships have worked. And that to me was this incredible opportunity, because we need to accelerate, right? That to me was the exciting part.
It's become an absolutely amazing book, and I want to thank you already, both of you, for sharing your wisdom and your practical knowledge with all of the students here today and those that are watching us online. We do want to give now the floor to the students, and they will ask questions. So I might ask to all of you, if you have a question, raise your hand, and then we'll come with the microphone. Question over there in the back.
Can we put the light on?
And a second question here in the front.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
If you get up, please, and a third question from there. If you have a question, please say your name, say anything about what you're studying or a little bit of background, and then ask your question. So we'll start with the gentleman over there. And if we can get some light so we can see you too. So the person there with, I think, the blue mask.
So many questions. All right. We'll have to be quick in our answers. We got, 10 minutes? Okay.
We'll do 20. Yep. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sebastian. I'm studying digital business in EU school. My question is, in Sweden, we have these measures for creating a sustainable future and using less plastic bags, using less gasoline. But in the end, sometimes the consumer pays the price. The plastic bags has tripled in price. The gasoline is highly taxed. How do we maybe prevent this? How do we tackle this so that the consumer doesn't pay the whole price?
Thank you for that question. And then maybe we'll get a second question from over here. Yep, go ahead. And then we'll answer both. And I'll get to you guys later.
Hi, I'm
You can
Jennifer.
stand up.
Okay, stand up. Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm coming from Germany. And first of all, very inspiring presentation. And I have a question. I used to work in a cosmetic company in Germany, and we had also a sustainability department. And for me, it was the question behind this. Okay, how can we create a carbon footprint in an industrial company? And my question to you, Paul, when you were working in Unilever and you were creating also a sustainability program, and then, for example, an industrial department, how it works. So it's like I don't meant to have a greenwash marketing program. It's not like that. So just for an example, how you can create or reduce the emissions regarding the carbon footprint.
Excellent
Thank you.
question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks.
So
I'll take the economic one
Yeah,
really
let's take
quickly.
that one.
I mean, this sounds silly, but to go back to my economics degree, a lot of whether a consumer pays is like, it's the elasticity of demand. There's these issues about whether companies can pass along additional costs or not, if there are more costs. And so right now, there's inflation everywhere. In the US, it's really bad. And yet companies are making more money than ever before because they're passing along all of the costs, because there's too much market power in most sectors, really. We haven't been breaking up monopolies for years, and they pass it all along. But I want to challenge the premise of the question, which is the assumption somehow that the more sustainable path is more expensive. It really depends on what we're talking about. The answer is not to use a lot of plastic bags over paper bags. It's to use a reusable bag that you bring over and over and over again, which saves you money, right? And the same thing happens at the corporate scale. And at the societal scale, you find solutions where it's actually saving for everyone. So if the price of oil is going up, like I frankly personally did not notice the price of gas was going up because I've driven an EV for 3 years. I didn't notice. I honestly, I was like, I saw the news, I was like, oh right, this is really hurting people. I hadn't pulled into a gas station in 3 years. And so part of the answer is you decarbonize your society, so if the price of, if the resource cost goes up and you're not using it, you don't care. Right? And so it's about decoupling, it's about changing the way we consume so that there isn't a cost to pass along. You're doing the more sustainable thing and it's actually saving you money. But this general idea that sustainable means kind of weaker products, I think that's dying pretty fast. And there's some, Tesla's one of the reasons they made EVs sexy and they're great cars, and so they're not worse products. And I think most companies now have no intention of putting out a more sustainable product that's weaker in some way. They want it to solve same price, same quality, or better, and have a more sustainable story, that's part of what makes it better. I don't think any company wants to put out a bag that's weaker because it's made from recycled content or something. So I think we're moving past that trade-off to some extent.
Thank you.
And it's broader than just material. Sustainable has the SESG, governance, or many other things companies can do. The WEF did a study and they found that making whole supply chain sustainable would actually take cost out to the extent of 9 to 16%. We now work with another social enterprise I created with whole industry sectors, fashion, food, tourist, and travel. And we find when we bring all of them together to drive these broader system changes, it actually goes straight to the bottom line. There's one point that is important in your question, that is people, let's take the US, in the last 5 decades, they haven't seen their incomes move up. This is one of the reasons that they're mad. And they have the rights to be mad. Cost of schooling, housing, healthcare have gone up, and their income actually in real terms has gone down. And now they're being asked to all change their gas boilers for electric boilers, and they have to pay the cost for it. In France, the protest of the Gilets jaunes was they were being told, buy diesel cars because you live in the countryside and that's the best way to drive and have the best price value. And then the next day, everybody who drives a diesel car is a criminal. And you need to change your car. And people say, I don't even have money. I can't even make it till Friday. So just transition is very important. How we do this and how we redistribute is a very important part of creating this inclusive society. We're working actively with the UK government, who has made a big commitment, I think, in terms of climate change, like the Europeans, with the Green Deal. But we're very carefully pointing out that a lot of the things we're doing, we need to be sure that the disadvantaged, the poorer parts of society, that they are actually coming out better. In the US, I think there's a moment that we will get a carbon price, but the US doesn't like tax, but you can get a carbon redistribution plan, a carbon dividend, where there is a price on carbon, which we definitely need, but where you redistribute it to the parts of the population that should not be out of pocket. It's very clear to me.
And Paul,
otherwise it's not going to work.
The question about how you do it in a company.
So how you do it in a company, it's very simple. Is obviously the normal things of change process, of setting goals and measuring them and reporting and all that stuff I don't want to go into. But there are two things that we did. I personally don't believe in a sustainability department because I think it should be all of us doing that. Just like a human rights HR department, human resource department is important, but we should all be human resource managers. So our sustainability department in Unilever, despite all the things that we did or got credit for, was only about 10 or 15 people. And actually, that small group was working on the corporate. There were some things that were non-negotiable for us. Non-negotiable is green energy, is zero waste, is sustainable sourcing. That permeates every brand. So what are your 5 or 10 non-negotiables? I think they're clear. A diversity. Well, for us, diversity, by the way, was a value chain. We took immediately the approach that it's our total handprint in society. So we were training 5 million smallholder farmers because I could see that Africa, for example, needed more jobs, but I wanted half of them to be women. So that's, for us, corporate, and this is where the sustainability department, if you want to, was playing a role, but not much, because a lot of that came into product supply or came into procurement, or because that's where the work had to be done, or in the countries itself. So they became enablers. The second area that we focused on was the brands itself. So in the brands, we put a love key in the middle when we built these brands. That was really, and the book talks about it, ingrained in the Sustainable Development Goals. So Dove became a brand that was fighting for women's self-esteem, when only 5% of women feel happy in the bodies they're in, because that's society imposes that on them. Lifebuoy helped a child reach the age of 5, when still 4 million children die of diarrhea, pneumonia that can be solved with hand washing. Lifebuoy, Domestos, a toilet bowl cleaner, set as objective to build 100 million toilets to attack the issues of open defecation. So, and it changed the narrative, If you work on Domestos and it's a toilet bowl cleaner and the only thing you do is grow your business and make money, it's not a good table discussion. And you might not feel as proud to work on the brand. But if you help tackle the issue of open defecation, man, are you making a difference in life? So bringing, what we found was that these brands that had a stronger purpose were actually growing faster and also more profitable. So that at that moment, really, the penny dropped. That was 4 or 5 years in, when we got the data, that people said, the 50, 60% of people that are sort of skeptical, sitting on the fence, they said, really, this is really right, because it makes the company stronger and actually makes the world better. These things don't need to be in conflict, by the way. I don't believe that. When some people came in and said, we need to do this or that, I always said, does it grow or is it more profitable? What does it do for the company? And if they said, well, we don't, but it's the right thing to do because the hospital next door needs sliding doors and wheelchairs, I said, think a little harder. because I'd rather do something that makes the company better so that we can do more of it. That's how you change the world. This is not philanthropy. Of course you need philanthropy. We've all sent clothes to Ukraine and put some money in a bank account to help people get through the disasters. But broadly, you need to make these business models work. So putting purpose at the core of your brands, whatever your brand is the most important thing. Now, my final sentence, I ask a lot of CEOs, what's your purpose? They don't know. The bulk of the CEOs start stuttering. They cannot get beyond the shareholder and money. But what's your purpose? You see, a profit is like white blood cells in your body. You need white blood cells to live. We all need white blood cells to live. But how many of us live for white blood cells? Hey, do you have more white blood cells today than yesterday? You look quite white blood cell, Andrew. Great. So that's, we need to get to this deeper meaning of why these businesses are there in the first place. And it's surprising how many people have not thought about it. That's why it's a leadership crisis. You guys need to come out of here and be part of that wave. The MBA programs, which are little Milton Friedmans on steroids, need to change to be able to have those discussions.
We're gonna get 2 more questions there, and then I want to get 2 questions to end from that side. So
we're also going to be sitting and signing books, so there'll be probably talking as we're signing.
So we'll be talking. So we get your question, the lady over there in the back.
I'll talk.
Yeah,
you can sign.
Signing my name, otherwise I'll forget it.
Sorry, I've seen your signature.
My name is Magid. I'm studying Innovation and Entrepreneurship Masters. And once again, thank you for touching on very important issues. Again, Milton Friedman right there on steroids. The beast is not changing. It doesn't appear to be changing. Again, it's interesting that 2020 came and hit us all, and we should have learned the lesson and kind of, awakened a bit, but it seems that we're still going back to the same trends. And the question is, do you think that we as human beings are just so addicted and pumped up to this, consumer capitalist model that we just keep on going with the grinder? Or do you think that there is hope that we need to kind of reset?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And we're going to get the second one from over there. And after those 2, we'll get to you. Go on.
Hello, my name is Mariam, and I'm from Kazakhstan, and I'm a first-year student in EU Business School. I'm studying international business. And my quick question is, how did you actually start your journey, and what would you suggest me to do right now as a young person who has all the time on the earth?
Thank you so much.
Good.
Thanks.
Go on.
So let me quickly say, so I think you're probably all going to get the book, and there's a section in here about what drives us as people. And I'm not a psychologist, but there's been a part of this 50-year model of Milton Friedman has been based in part on a couple deep misunderstandings of both Adam Smith and Charles Darwin. There's this assumption that we as people just have basically 2 drives. We want to get stuff, acquire it, and we want to defend it, and that's it. And it's always been true. And that's how people have interpreted Charles Darwin and set up kind of the modern economy, that it's a dog-eat-dog world. That's not what he said. Darwin was about those who can adapt survive, not those who kill everyone else survive. And adapt can also mean working in partnership like nature does, fundamentally. But that there's fundamentally 2 other drives that have been studied many times, which is we also want to bond and understand and comprehend. And if you build a company or an economy around all 4 of those drives, you get a very different outcome than if you're just assuming that we want more stuff. Because there's been many studies that show once you get past a level of sufficiency, and I don't mean just having enough food, but it might mean you can send your kids to college, you can take a vacation every now and then, you have the basics, the correlation of money and happiness disappears, right? I mean, fundamentally disappears, because that's not what drives your happiness. Once you have enough. So if we can get the world to a level of sufficiency, that's the kind of minimum standard. It's not then about more stuff. And so we are in an addictive system, right? It is addictive in this model that CEOs want more and more, that hedge fund guys want more and more. It's not enough if they made $100 million income this year because the guy down the street made $200 million, right? I mean, we are competitive, but we have to start connecting to the other parts of our drives. And I think, frankly, as I said at the very beginning of my talk, The polls show it, anecdotally I hear it, the young millennials, the Gen Zs that are just hitting the workforce, they clearly have a fuller sense of those drives and want from work a mix. They want the companies they buy from and work for to treat them as individuals and not just cogs to make more and more money. And companies are feeling that. I don't think most CEOs get it because they've been brought up in this, everyone grab as much as you can, but they know they have to speak this way for the next generation. So it's up to everyone to say, I don't just want more stuff. I don't just want the higher salary. I want to know what I'm doing for a living. We have to push back on that and speak to, everyone says this thing about on your deathbed, what are you going to remember? But it is true. You're not going to remember that you got a bonus 30 years ago. It's going to be, did I see my kids thrive? Did I spend enough time with them? On and on and on. It isn't going to be about money.
And Paul, if you're 20 now, as the question was,
right.
How do you get started on that?
Yeah, no, it's very important. Let me finish Andrew's sentence here for a second. So human beings, we have a hard time thinking exponential. Right. We can think linear. So the problem of exponentiality needs to be better explained. And we are doing a poor job in that also with climate change. It's a fundamental difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. The second thing is we are not so good actually thinking long term because it's our survival thing. So we think short term. Look how quickly we reacted to COVID when the crisis was there and how we sort of were able to manage that. Climate change is a little bit longer. I don't think it's as long as people think, but we know. And then thirdly, we don't react very well to fear. Because then we get into the little bit of the Frontex here and we start to fight or freeze or flight. Instead, so making the story more of a hope-driven story, an opportunity-driven story. This book is net positive. It's not called net negative. So I think are some of the things. There are other things on human beings, but we need to understand that communication part or positioning part or framing part that we haven't done very well, in my opinion. When you start, I was just in Jerusalem, so I hope the country is going better because you've also had your challenges there in Kazakhstan. And but I would advise is very simply it's easier said than done, but try to not just interview on prestige or on salary and all that stuff, but try to find this sweet spot of what you like to do, what you're good at, and what the world needs. I never saw myself as a businessman. I always thought I found out what I'm reasonably good at, I guess, but also what I like and what the world needs. And actually, my satisfaction has come always with a lot of enthusiasm every day I worked. I really have never been really that demotivated in my career because I was focused on what I needed, was what the world needs was in line with my values and also what I liked to work on. And then obviously the skill of becoming good at it, you work on that. But bringing people together, forcing these partnerships, working on the brick and system changes was something that I like to do. And I used Unilever. The reason I stayed for 10 years in Unilever was not necessarily by I want to stay 10 years in Unilever, but I could use the size and scale of that company to drive more transformative changes. That actually was more interesting to me than just saying, oh, he turned Unilever around or he had a 300% shareholder return. As Andrew says, nobody remembers that anyway, nor did I really care. These are results of what you do, but what you're doing is something bigger than just these numbers. So try to find that and look for companies where you feel that you can get to that intersection. You understand? And it's not about the first job. It's not about your first boss. I know it's important, People always say you join companies and you leave people. But at the end of the day, there's a little bit of a bigger picture here. And I think more people take that reflection now in terms of looking for companies or where they're going to work. Because frankly, you have a choice. Interestingly, when I started working in 1979, was really the economies weren't that good. I had to send out a lot of resumes to find a company that would accept me. Perhaps I wasn't that good, was probably also true. But
I think there was also an oil crisis going on.
There was a little oil crisis going on and some other things. But now you have a much better position as you go into the workforce, to be honest, to find what you want. I'm the chairman of the Said Business School. I'm on the board of IESE here and INSEAD, and these schools and yourself not excluded. It seems to me, at least from what I read and hear and the numbers, that it should be relatively easy to find that intersection now versus some other times in the last 20, 30 years.
I believe that the framework you're referring to, is that right? Is it called Ikigai? That's sort of
the Ikigai, the
I
Japanese.
don't know what it's called.
They have four circles.
Intersection between what you like, what you're good at, and what the world needs.
Yeah, and then someone would add also what pays your salary.
What pays your salary, I think, is
so
the
that must be the fourth one.
And maybe, I think we've all liked this conference so much, and we would, I think, need your books and your signatures, so we're going to get to that in just a minute. But I promised before we do so, the two last questions, the lady over there, and I think one...
All right, we got to do lightning round, right? Like 1 minute answers.
Yeah. 1 minute answer. Go ahead. Yeah, you go.
I'm from Ukraine.
I'm sorry.
And I'm a student. And I have a question to you. How to convey CEO of the world companies that leaving the Russian market can save the lives of civilians? Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize, the light's not so good, so I didn't see. Sorry. Go on with the second question here. If we can pass on. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Fabrizio. I'm an international business student. And going back to the growth question, you have said that people are getting out of poverty at exponential rates. And as people get out of poverty, they consume more resources, so their carbon footprint increases as well. So my question is, how far are we from decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation so that we can tackle both inequalities and climate change without being counterproductive?
Thank you.
I'll just say quickly, the answer is we're really far. I mean, Paul gave the statistic of roughly 8% of material is reused. We're very far from a circular economy, and it's been talked about for years and years. So there needs to be a huge acceleration, which is part of the message that we have about the partnerships, the systemic partnerships, to try to start to find exponential change towards the positive end. If you start to bring everyone together, like we're seeing in palm oil, I think you can start to have these step change, not a linear change, but huge change. We're very far from it. And that's why there's a combination of needing to dial back some consumption. Like the example of eating less meat, I think is the easiest, quickest way for people to have an impact, while the system starts to change and hopefully there's more and more meat made from regenerative agriculture farms so that they're actually sequestering carbon, or meat, lab-grown meat, or some of the other possibilities. In the meantime, we got to do some cutting back, right, in ways that I think are not enormous sacrifices, but start to put pressure on the system to move to better practices. So we're still a very long way, and time is very short, and that's kind of the urgency that we feel in putting this out there.
Yeah. What is the most worrying is that we're very close to negative feedback loops. Even the Amazon, which has been the lungs of the world for the world, they are actually 20% more deforestation, and they become carbon emitters. We have seen the Borealis now melting because of global warming, releasing methane, so it becomes a negative feedback loop. Because the world is warming, we see more air conditioning machines, more carbon emission, negative feedback loop. So in many systems, we need to look at these negative feedback loops and attack them very, very quickly. So geomimics, which is really the engineering solution to climate change, will be needed. I was never a big fan of nuclear, but will be needed. But we really, beyond having waited so long, solutions that would have been ideal and could have been avoided if we would have acted earlier. But we now, so let's say we've killed the world whale population. And it's about 3% to 5% left of what the world's whale population was. The whales are actually incredibly efficient in taking carbon out of the air. But by killing the whale population, we've probably, cut off one of the most effective machines. The whale poop, if I may call it that way, excuse me, is the plankton that grows on the surface that actually absorbs the CO2. So now we are biomimicrying the whale poop and trying to spread that over the oceans. There are big tests going on. And see, the Arctic is melting, or the Antarctic. We're trying to see if we can create clouds that then drift above it, so that there is a shadow at least at 3 or 4 months during the year, so that we can protect the ice there and change the weather patterns and cycles. So biomimicry will become more important as well, and catching these negative feedback loops will be absolutely crucial. I think on the Ukraine, we've talked it a lot. This afternoon I have 2 phone calls on that. One was the 30 biggest food companies we've called together, because there's a food crisis that is way out of proportion coming in. Wheat and corn coming from that part of the world is about 30%. These supply chains are disrupted. So the whole world will be affected by that. And we are having a meeting with the International Chambers of Commerce, which I chaired, which is 48 million companies, where we have the biggest companies on the phone to see what can be done. Individual companies have made decisions, and we respect whatever these decisions are. Are they more, are they less than I would have done? It's very difficult for us to judge that, because we are not the CEOs of those companies. And there are many factors that they need to weigh in their decisions. Some have made quick commitments, but it turned out they hardly have any business there. Some have made big claims, but it means they hardly do anything different. I will not take on new business 5 years from now type statements will not work here. So what are the more effective responses to get to a situation that obviously results in a faster peace that we all want again? And it's better done collectively, in my opinion, than individually. To go after individual companies and become the judges of wisdom when we don't have all the facts, I find that a little bit difficult, even as a CEO. There's some minimum things that need to be done, I understand that, but it's difficult. But collectively we can. For example, when collectively the world said we're not opening airspace anymore, collectively the world says we're cutting you off from the SWIFT transfer system of money. Collectively, we're going to freeze your assets that are in other countries. You know, it doesn't seem to me too difficult to find out where all the boats are of the Russian oligarchs. So, you know, the satellites will probably have told us that already 10 million times. And they're not hard to miss by the size of these things going around the world. So there are some things we can do collectively between all the countries. And interestingly, if we like it or not, that collectiveness is there. If there's anything chosen, there were only 2 countries that kept seated, Venezuela and Syria. And the rest walked all out. We've never seen the world so united on an issue. This is not like who's right or wrong, or this is about our future of humanity is at stake. This is for all of us. This is obviously for the people of the Ukraine and the people of other parts of the world that suffer. We always have that compassion. But this right now affects the whole world in a way that we've never seen before. This is more than what we've had to fight with other wars in the past. And interestingly now, I believe that even China will pretty quickly come as well. China has been on the sideline because they have an intention to go after Taiwan, and I think that's probably part of their reasons why they are a little bit careful in speaking out. But I think with the wisdom that the Chinese have, the longer-term view, it's like for business, like for these countries, it's in their interest to show that global solidarity now. Am I hopeful? I don't know. It's a small window. And every day we're sitting here talking about the theory of it. Innocent people are dying. So I'm very sad inside. But I also always look at it from this is the situation that we have. What can we now do collectively to get out of it? It is much better now to focus our energy on the solution when something happens to you that you can't really control sometimes, than that you spend too much time on the issue itself. You understand what I'm saying? And I think the pressure is building up in a way that I personally hope, sincerely, that there is a good solution coming out in a shorter time frame than longer. I think we all would agree with that.
Paul, I really appreciate that you've been willing to lean in to the difficult questions, the difficult issues. Andrew, you call it the elephants in the room. I think we certainly did that today. We talked about so many issues, and my takeaway is that one of the crucial things we need when it comes to whether it comes to climate change or war is cooperation, is partnership, and that we can get there. We can get to a net positive world. And so I want to thank both of you on behalf, I think, of everyone here for a wonderful conference. And I invite all of you to give you a little bit more work after this with a book signing. And Andrew,
I just
you want to
quickly
point.
thank you, Peter, for being such an advocate of our work and bringing us here and making this happen. And we're filming, and we filmed some stuff yesterday, and this helps us, get the ideas out. And thank you for bringing it to, a school with so much reach and students that are going to go do some amazing things. So thank you.
I want to ask everyone to give a big hand, and then Claire is going to leave you. Hold on.
Okay, let me just say thank you once again on behalf of us, of all of us at EU Business School. We have some great net positive leaders here in front of us. Thank you for inspiring them, and also thank you for agreeing to do a book signing. You'll all be able to understand more about this amazing approach, which is really revolutionizing business, by receiving a book that can be signed outside now on the patio by Paul and Andrew. So thank you, and another round of applause, please. Okay.
Bronza, pedra, fusta.